Hey reader, this is Centaur here, and today we are continuing in our army ranking series, looking at the options available to you in second edition and how they've changed going into third edition. We've now reached the top 10, and at this point, things are probably going to start getting a little more controversial, especially since today's choice is one that had a relatively recent quote unquote army update near the end of second edition. Basically, right there at the twilight, it got a whole bunch of new options, including a whole new suite of army special rules. But I still stand by my decision on this as to where it ranks, and that is I think 10th place in our rankings is Italy. Now, this is a weird one because the Italians are hypothetically, they're one of the big three for the Axis powers during World War II. As regards how much their army is fleshed out in the book, they have one of the larger army lists. I mean, if you had to count the two biggest and the most major of the minor nations, I think it's fair to say that it's France and Italy. But as we're going to see here, what we're talking about in this series is not how likely you are to win a game or win a tournament using Italy. It's how strong the options are that are available to you. And we're going to find that Italy, while it does play very effectively, especially in a post case blue scenario, it is not the strongest set of options. There are quite a few traps available, and they really rely on about 10 profiles or so in order to get their effectiveness. And they find themselves missing and lacking in several areas that I think would help them quite a bit. So to start us off, when we look at the Army Special Rules, we should probably start with a question mark, which is, which set of Army Special Rules are we reviewing? So I decided in the name of fairness to just review both to show you what was happening and really also provide the reasoning as to why in Case Blue they got a whole new set of rules. So to start off, in the Armies of Italy and the Axis book, the book that came out with, I believe it was first edition, and carried all the way over until the Get You By PDF that now exists for third, we had two special rules, and that is Avanti Savoia and defensive positions. Now, both of these were extremely hard to summarize effectively and fairly for the purpose of this, because to be honest, they're both pretty wordy and there's a lot of stuff going on. And yet there's a lot of stuff going on that isn't helpful. So to start with, Avanti Savoia was a bookkeeping special rule that was helpful or not helpful based on a lot of factors. But fundamentally, it comes down to this. As the match goes on, when you first start out, Avanti Savoia actually doesn't kick in. And then at any point when the Italian player has removed three or more order dice more than the opponent has removed of theirs, then their entire army gains a basically battlefield-wide +2 morale, which is really good, by the way. It means that, obviously veterans aren't really going to be helped because in second edition, an 11 and a 12 always failed, right? But it did mean that even if your veterans were heavily pinned down, you might still pass, right? Because you might still be getting closer to that 10, which was the best that you could probably hope for. But it came with a trade-off, and this is what was intended to kind of make it a little more fair. Not only do you have to be removing enemy order dice faster than they're removing yours, but in addition to that, there was also a -2 morale penalty to all of your men if your opponent had removed three or more of your order dice more than you had removed of theirs. So if the battle starts to turn, and it starts to turn an awful lot, then the morale of your men, even of your veterans, starts to take a nosedive, which meant you really did need some higher officer morale bubbles and stuff like that in order to try to reliably keep things in place in case you were afraid of these. But at the same time, it meant that if you started really removing enemy units, then the extra morale bubbles didn't really matter. So it was problematic on so many levels. It had questions about how do you build your army. It had questions about what are you going to be facing. It had questions about what are the deployment scenario objectives, and all kinds of stuff could all make it so that Avanti Savoia either is too easy on your part or it just goes vastly against you. And it was super swingy. And so the result is, probably unsurprisingly, a lot of players didn't really like it. And I can see this as being the pure reason why we would want to maybe renegotiate or rework special rules. The second one was defensive positions. And this one said that in the case of an attacker defender scenario, which is already only half of the scenarios in second edition, then when rolling to see who the attacker or defender is, then the Italian player can re-roll their dice, which is kind of nice. And then if they are the defender, so keep in mind, this is an even smaller subset than half. And in a tournament setting, this was even less than half because a lot of attacker defender scenarios other than sectors weren't really used very commonly. It was much more common to see, standard games with standard scenarios instead of an attacker defender scenario. But in this case, if that was the case, then the opponent couldn't issue run orders on turn one. The Italians could re-roll their artillery barrages, so there was an encouragement to take an artillery forward observer. You got D3 defensive embankments, which were actually really cool. I've included a picture down there at the bottom left, you can see, and it's a 6-inch by 6-inch square with heavy cover on 3 sides. And Dewey Cat Productions has created a free file that you can download, by the way, that has some really interesting and thematic versions of these, stone walls and, crates and fuel drums and stuff like that for your men to hide behind. It's actually pretty cool stuff, and they print really easily. So do highly recommend that you go ahead, take a look at those, download those off of Wargaming 3D or wherever you get your Dewey Cat files from, and throw them in some extra cash just as a bit of extra thank you and love for what he's doing to help level up the hobby. I'll try to link to it down below as well, just that way you have it. But you get those defenses and you get to place D3 of them. And then in addition to that, you would gain the hidden special rule when you were defending. Now, all of this is extremely difficult with the new edition, and it kind of makes sense that they would at least get a revamp in third because, re-rolling the artillery barrage is useful, don't get me wrong, and that is a nice benefit. The defensive benefit is there, but the whole attacker-defender scenario thing is more of a narrative play thing now. It isn't really part of the competitive scene. Hidden special rules, also more of a narrative thing, so it doesn't really appear anymore. So already a good portion of the rule just disappears by virtue of changes that were made to the game. Changes that, by the way, in general, I'm in favor of. I don't think that there's a problem per se with that. So suffice it to say, the special rules were, they were fine, but they were super situational. Maybe they came into play, maybe they didn't. Maybe they only came about to hurt you. And so if I had to give a rating just to the ones from the book, the rating is not very good. But then we have Case Blue. And with Case Blue, we end up with some new special rules. Okay, fundamentally, there are really 3 special rules. There's technically more than them. There's 5, but they really come down to 3. And the first is improvised AT, where we get to re-roll the wounding rolls for any of our heavy weapons that have a +2 penetration modifier, which, overwhelmingly is going to be your AT rifles, which is your only AT infantry option, which is nice. And your light autocannons, which also get a pen +2. But technically speaking, a medium mortar also has a +2 modifier on its penetration roll. And I guess technically a heavy AT gun rolling HE, right? Because it's a 2-inch HE template would also get that. Light howitzer would also get that. And so the result is that these are not big, heavy weapons, but they might encourage you to run these things, which were thematically used in very large numbers by the Italian army. And it at least makes it so that if you're headhunting 5s or 6s or something like that on a unit, it makes you more reliable. And in the case of something like a medium mortar, it would also make you more reliable in terms of doing damage to infantry, which is really nice. Again, I don't think this is the most amazing special rule ever, but I think it's good. I think that it's very thematic. I think that it can be very powerful. And it's not so overpowered. I think this is a good example of a well-balanced but still useful army special rule. They have a large squad bonus, so if they have 14 or more men in a squad and they hit, then they do D2 pins instead of 1, which on the one hand, it is nice to have the possibility of doing multiple pins, but to be honest, half the time you're going to be doing 1. Right? That's the thing about D2, right? D2 does not equal 2. It is sometimes 1 and it is sometimes 2. So on the whole, I don't think it really moves the needle all that much in terms of the strength of the special rules, but hey, it's nice to have. It comes with the trade-off that you have to spend an awful lot of points on a single squad. So, handle that as you will. Be careful of high explosive damage because that can really wreck the squad. So just be careful. But on the whole, I think it's a fine special rule. It's okay. It does have its uses. And then you had 3 special rules that were tied just to your infantry, and they kind of locked you into ways to play. And I think we are going to see something like these as your 3 subtypes in 3rd edition when the book comes out, probably sometime in 2026. More on that at the end of the video. But the first rule was that your black shirts, instead of having just a D6 roll to see whether or not they got a fanatics on 5s up or whether they got shirkers or, something like that, basically a version of green, instead they just start with fanatics, which is quite nice. And then your Alpini infantry and any of your, oh, by the way, this fanatic benefit also applies to regular headquarters units. So if you take your officer at regular instead of, say, inexperienced, then they get fanatics for free, which is nice. And then for any Alpini modeled headquarters unit and for any Alpini units that you have, which are kind of their mountaineers, then they get stubborn. And the Alpini modeled headquarters units also gain the Mountaineers' basically fieldcraft ability that the Alpini have. So if you want to play more of a mountain man sort of force, you had the ability to do so. And then if you took a Bersaglieri unit or a veteran headquarters unit that is not modeled as an Alpini unit, then it gains fire and maneuver. Now, fire and maneuver would be more useful if you had to pay for submachine guns and such on these guys, but you don't. And so the result is that like it was useful on headquarters units if you took a a rifle on them, but otherwise you wouldn't really use it. And then for your standard Bersaglieri, it did mean that your rifles and your light machine guns could both move and shoot without a penalty each turn, which is really nice. And I don't want to negate that. Light machine guns were not as well costed in second edition as they were in third edition. So like you were still pumping up the squad by quite a bit, and they were becoming quite expensive if you really wanted to take advantage of fire maneuver. It's fine. I mean, again, like it's a good special rule. I don't think all three of these are created equal though. In general, I would probably go for a fanatic regulars because I can take those in large numbers, or maybe stubborn, highly mobile troops. That way I can land on objectives relatively reliably and stay there with Alpini over and against fire maneuver Bersaglieri. And having played against both Bersaglieri and Black Shirts in tournament games before, I kind of still feel that way. Suffice it to say, these are the Army Special rules. I think they're fine for Case Blue. I don't think that these are like, amazing write home about it to your mom sort of stuff. But they're definitely a step up from where they were with the original book. As we look at headquarters options, honestly, they're fine. I mean, your officers are average to good in that you do get access to inexperienced guys, which is great, but nothing particularly special going on here, other than obviously the fact that they could have fanatics for free, and they could have fire maneuver for free, or they could have stubborn or mountaineers for free, which is kind of nice. Keep in mind, though, some of those do require you to buy them at veteran, which I wouldn't generally recommend on your officer. Your forward observers are fine. You get access to all of the forward observers. If you like them, you can do them. If you're playing with the original Italy rules, you could get potentially a reroll on your barrage attempt with the artillery observer. Might be worth doing that, but keep in mind that's only in an attacker defender scenario. And then your medics are fine. You get access to veteran medics. It would be nice if you got access to regular ones, but veterans are okay. And no specialized officers. As we look at infantry, your inexperienced troops are fine. You get pretty substantial access to green and shirker units if you like them. I think these are okay. I'm not entirely sure, especially if you have the old Italian rules. I don't think you would want shirkers because it increases the chance that you're going to lose a unit, and that potentially causes your entire morale across your army to dip with Avanti Savoia. So it's problematic. But they do have a colonial force option that can take horses. So you can get inexperienced cavalry, which is kind of interesting. Other than that, honestly, not much here. There's actually quite a few traps between light machine guns and stuff like that available to you. So I'd probably pass on inexperienced troops as a general rule for Italy. With your regulars, they're fine without Case Blue. They're good post Case Blue, because with Case Blue you get access to things like the Black Shirts M Battalion, which is the guys who can start with fanatics for free. Otherwise, in the original book, Black Shirts are difficult. I probably wouldn't take them personally because you have basically the same chance of something really negative happening with them as you do of becoming fanatics. So I'd probably pass, especially because, again, regular troops are easier to remove than veterans, so maybe not worth it taking all of those Black Shirts. I don't know. You also got access to the Fusilieri in Case Blue, which, I mean, they're fine. Again, like, it comes down to if you want big squads, if you want, some interesting or niche special rules, they do technically exist. But on the whole, a lot of their infantry for the regular section is just dudes with rifles, access to one light machine gun, possibly access to a couple of submachine guns. That's it, right? There's nothing particularly special about most of these. So we're not going to go too deep into this. And by the way, the note from the Hungry video, by the way, we are not going to do a deep dive into every single option, and we're not going to go really deep into each of those. One, because second edition is something that's in its twilight phase, so we're not going to go deep into that, and we don't know how it's going to change going into third. But third, because I think in general, there's nothing that really appeals in the regular section that isn't specialized. And so we'll talk more about specialist infantry and less about the ones that are mostly the same as your standard, line and rank and file infantry. In the veteran section, honestly, this stuff is fantastic. You get access to veteran cavalry. You've always had access to that, but in the post-blue world, they get even better because they get the ability, instead of regrouping, to potentially do a second charge. Now, if they have pins on them, they have to take a second order test. So they might end up panicking if you don't, right? Things just to keep in mind. But in general, very useful ability. I'm not entirely sure that I like the idea of giving some people second charges just because I like to not break the core rules of the game very often, especially for a unit that people don't always see, like cavalry. Cavalry is one of the ones that a lot of players could go throughout their lives never playing against or with, depending on the armies that they play with. So, uh, they're good. Don't get me wrong. We'll see if the change sticks around going into third edition. Your Bersaglieri are fine in the normal edition. They get even, well, in the normal book, they get even better with Case Blue. Your Paracadutisti, which is your paratroopers. I mean, they're paratroopers. They get submachine guns, lots of them. You take like up to 8 of them, which is not bad. And your San Marco Marines give you the ability to outflank without a penalty. Because these guys have to be taken at veteran, though, it's a lot of points to have off table. So I'm not personally sure that I would want to put veterans in outflank, especially since they don't have like dramatic numbers of submachine guns. They can't take a flamethrower. It's not like they have like, really, really powerful stuff that would make them need to get up close and personal. They're mostly riflemen. So, uh, I mean, they're fine. They're fine. But again, this is a good set of veterans. They give you lots of interesting options, and there's no one clear winner. They load you up with lots of options. And that's before we even start looking at the specialists. And the specialists, we get Alpini, which have, mountaineers, which is basically fieldcraft. So you can move through rough terrain, pretty much any rough terrain without any penalty, which is awesome. You get the Croatian Legion. The Croatian Legion are the kinds of guys you would want to have near your officers because when they're activated with a snap 2, they remove 2 pins. And then they perform their test if necessary. So these guys are pretty reliable as long as the officer's telling them what to do, which is, again, it's interesting and it's cool and it does have utility because you don't know what the other enemy is running, and if they're running a heavy pin generation style force, it is nice to have the ability to just be able to shrug them a little more reliably. Your Montecaverno infantry are another kind of veteran unit that has an interesting special rule that I'd love to see elsewhere for other nations, which is that they always use their full morale for any morale test they have to make, which includes order tests. So you literally cannot pin these guys down. And again, they're veterans, so they're starting on a morale of 10, which is really sweet. I don't know that this is necessarily better than the Cavalleria. I don't know this is necessarily better than the Gustatori. But it is a very useful ability. And again, it would incline somebody to maybe take a look at running some Montecaverno instead. And then we have the Gossatori. The Gossatori are an engineer unit, so they're better at removing minefields. They're better at removing other defensible position stuff. But they're also one of the few infantry sections that can take not just a flamethrower, because not every nation gets access to a flamethrower that's embedded in an infantry section. They get access to 2 flamethrowers if you're taking a Gossatori destruction group, which honestly is pretty sweet, especially since that means you could split fire with these flamethrowers and potentially flamethrow 2 things on a given turn instead of the 1, which is awesome. So on the whole, infantry are pretty good. Again, post Case Blue, they get really good. A little more middling before that. As we look at the team weapons, honestly, there's really not much to look here. This is actually one of the things that kind of lets us down. We don't have anything particularly special with the machine gun teams, just a medium machine gun here. Your mortars are fine with light and medium mortars. Those are fine. Your AT teams include AT rifles, which are very cheap and useful, which is good because you're going to need those points for running veteran infantry or some of the armored choices that you get. So it's nice to be able to save points there and still get a reliable pin generator. Your sniper team is normal, regular veteran, take what you want. Flamethrower teams, you get the regular and veteran flamethrower, nothing particularly special there, and no special team weapons. So honestly, this one's on par with a lot of what you expect from other nations. Nothing particularly great to write home about, but nothing particularly bad either. For your artillery sections, they're good in that you get access to all 3. So depending on what you like and what you need, you have the ability to custom tailor your big explosive HE side of things. They're slightly below good though, and so I'm marking them as average to good because you can't take any of them inexperienced. In general, I didn't tend to take howitzers inexperienced because the whole point of taking a howitzer over and against a mortar is that the howitzer can fire direct and indirect, so I don't want that -1 to hit penalty. It's also really bad if people start shooting back at you, you start stacking up pins, and then your howitzer that you paid for isn't really doing anything for you. I don't much like that at all. So in general, I don't tend to take howitzers inexperienced, but I mean, it's not going to hurt you. In general, again, most players aren't going to really notice. So there's that. Anti-tank guns are fine. A lot of traps in this case. You have a light anti-tank gun, you have a medium AT gun, you've got, even larger ones. In general, I actually tend to go with the Case Blue Modelo 37, which is it's one of those versatile AT guns. That's a medium AT gun and a light howitzer. So again, this is a post Case Blue thing. They would have rated a lot lower if we didn't have Case Blue. They're fine. Again, I'm not sure that you necessarily need to take an AT gun in this case. And with your anti-aircraft guns, you get access to the Breda 20 millimeter, which is a fine light autocannon. It gets even better with the Case Blue rules, right? Because you get to re-roll those fail to wound rolls as long as you're not doing your 1-inch HE template. So quite useful, but again, also pretty limited in terms of what you can use it for because it is only a +2 modifier to the damage roll. No innate access to rocket launchers means that as we move into armored support, this one's a really mixed bag and part of what drags Italy down in terms of the rankings. First of all, their tanks are good. You get machine gun tankettes that are pretty fragile, but they are a good baseline for machine gun fire if you just need to mow down infantry. And then between the M11, 13, and 15 range of tanks, you get a lot of machine guns alongside typically a light AT gun. Damage values typically around an 8, often vulnerable. So not necessarily the best. The M1542 allows you to be damage value 8 without vulnerable with that light AT gun and 4 machine guns effectively. So that's not horrible. You know, these are good tanks. Pretty fragile. So if your opponent's taking any serious anti-tank, even just light AT guns, you could end up with some problems. So just be prepared for that. But in general, pretty good options. Your tank destroyers, I'm not going to lie, are actually pretty bad. You only get a couple. They're all in the Semavente style family of stuff. The Semavente 75 is fine. It's basically a Stug 3. And Stug 3, as we've talked about before with some of the Axis support minor nations, and as we'll talk about more in depth with Germany, is good. The Stug is good. But all of the others are pretty bad, actually. They're really expensive for what you get. The vast majority of them are open-topped, which is not particularly surprising for tank destroyers, but a lot of open-top tank destroyers for other nations are pretty cheap. And some of these are really not. I just don't think you get enough out of these to justify not taking a proper tank in its place, especially since you can only take the one in second edition, right? For your cheap self-propelled guns, they're fine. I mean, it's a very cheap medium howitzer. It's very fragile, right? And this is the one problem, right? They don't even have a damage value 8 self-propelled gun, right? I mean, they're running really, really light on this. And again, I guess I just asked the question, is that more useful than a proper tank? I'm not sure that it is. And then your anti-aircraft platforms are really one. You have a truck that either has a light autocannon in the back or it has a super heavy AT gun with the stabilizers, which basically means you can't move and shoot in the same turn. Honestly, I think these aren't horrible. If you find that you were running like a ton of infantry sections that were veteran and big, it might be nice just to have a zippy light autocannon running around. TV6 soft skin vehicles were a lot more survivable in second edition than they are in third. So in general, I don't think that that's horrible. I don't think it's particularly great. And especially when you start comparing them to some of the AA options that are coming out from future nations, I just don't think that this is particularly impressive. They don't have any specialized vehicles or weird armor that we need to talk about. But just suffice it to say here, I mean, they're fine, right? I mean, it's a fine selection. I do think there's like 2 or 3 standout options. But in general, I mean, they're okay. As we get to the armored cars, these are actually really good. You have things like the L6 little tankette, which you can run with an autocannon, which is pretty zippy and pretty sweet and pretty cheap. You could also bump it instead to a flamethrower. So if you really want to lean into the barbecue build, you can take a flamethrower tankette in your tank section. They have access to one of those. You also have a flamethrower option here in your tankette section for your armored cars. So you could take one of those as well. And that would give you 2 vehicle-based flamethrowers in addition to your infantry flamethrowers, and you can get quite a few of those. More on that when we talk about the list. You also have armored cars. The Auto Blinda is fantastic with the light auto cannon. I was talking with Tor Swanson the other day, and he was mentioning that, he actually runs his in reverse. I own an Auto Blinda, but it's still in the box, so I haven't actually played with one before. But his whole thing is that he runs it in reverse. That way he can use that reverse-facing machine gun, and he just turns the turret for the autocannons. That way he can do that. And sure, like, you may not move quite as much with it because you're reversing the whole way, but it does work, and it means that you won't reverse off the table, which is always nice. It's pretty cool. I like the Auto Blend. It's a very nice, damage value 7 autocannon sort of armored car, which is good. You have the Sahariana. The Sahariana was pretty good in second edition. This right here is the Warlord model for the Sahariana. It is cheap at 30 points regular, but that's because it doesn't have anything on it. You got to buy guns and stuff like that to add to it. I think that, forward-facing machine gun is not necessarily a bad idea. And then I went with an auto cannon because it's on a turret, so works out pretty nicely to have that sort of thing. Again, it's pretty zippy. It's not too expensive for what you might expect to have, but on the whole, I mean, it's not a, it's fine. There's one thing though about the Sahariana that I wanted to talk about though, because this is something people don't talk about. From a stats perspective, it's great. Um, but herein lies the problem. And for this, I'm going to compare it to another unit. Okay. So here we have the Sahariana, right, that we've talked about. And here, put in front of it, is the M1139 tank, which is one of the machine gun tanks that I talked about earlier. The Sahariana is actually longer than this tank by a good bit, over half an inch. So, I mean, this is not a particularly small armored car. It is a good bit longer than a proper tank, which is far more resilient than it. Second, and you might have noticed this by how I'm holding it up, they're almost the same height. So it's not like it's more, low profile and zippy than the armored car. And again, these are the official models, right? This isn't a 3D print that was made in the wrong scale. This is the real actual model. And you can really see the difference in size. I'm going to go ahead and take out my swivelly light autocannon here. You can see the difference here. It's a lot bigger. So while in general, I think the Sahariana is fine. Again, I bought one, so I'm a partisan in that regards, right? I do apparently like the Sahariana, at least in second edition. But I keep going back to, why wouldn't I just buy one of these? And I think that because of that, if I'm trying to save myself some points, the Sahariana might be the kind of thing I might cut. Or I might decide, I need to cut some infantry, I need to go even bigger and actually go with an auto blinda, which is not as big as the Sahariana. The Sahariana is actually larger than the auto blinda as well. So, like, it's fine. It's okay. I think you have better options personally, so I wouldn't really risk too much trying to do that. And then the auto blinda Linz, I just wouldn't do. I don't think it's worth more than the auto blinda AB41. It's just not as good. So mixed bag in the armored cars, but still good options all around. I think if you go with an L6 or an AB41, I think you're going to be in good shape. As we look at tows and transports, their soft transports are good. You get access to the common ones that everybody gets, which are great, but you also get access to a 4-man car, which means that you could have a slightly more resilient officer running around with a flamethrower team. You could also put an AT rifle in with a flamethrower, so that way the flamethrower can go off and do some crazy shenanigans while the AT rifle just kind of parks and starts going after team weapons. You've got options, and they're not half bad options, so that's always nice. Armored carriers are not so great. You have the Auto Protetto, which is an open-topped, relatively large, relatively expensive armored transport. Again, most armored transports are not particularly great in second edition. They do get a nice bump in third, and the Auto Protetto does get a bump up as well to increase their capacity size going into third, but they didn't have that over in second. So not particularly great ranking in the carriers. The gun transports are fine because you can put machine guns on a truck, which is always fine. And then their tows are okay. You get access to a relatively cheap armored tractor. So if you want a mobile heavy cover option, they do have those. And then no guns on your toes because very few nations get those. So on the whole, in terms of your options, the army is fine. I think in general, they lack a lot of the killing power that you would like to see from infantry, unless you're running Gossatori, or if you decide to go really up close and personal with a transport and take the paratroopers. But in general, it's a lot of just rifle fire. Maybe you throw in some LMGs. There's not a whole lot there. Their artillery is a little lackluster. Their teams are fine. Their tanks are pretty good as long as you don't hit somebody who took a medium AT gun. Like on the whole, they're okay, but they have some pretty clear gaps in their inventory. So in terms of what I would take, I have about a list of 4 or 5 infantry that I would probably consider taking. Because they're pretty sweet. You could go the Bersaglieri route if you just don't want to lose a lot of units. You can go the fanatical black shirt route. You can go the Alpini route. You could go the Montecavirno route if you want to make sure you always activate every time that you really want to, probably, and that you never run off of the battlefield. You could even technically go inexperienced cavalry or veteran cavalry if you want to. Maybe even a mix of both, and you go fully mounted, much like a Polish army, but you have like 2 or 3 squads of veterans and then like 2 squads of inexperienced cavalry that can kind of screen for them, which would be very interesting. So all kinds of options that you can take advantage of. Very expensive because all those models pretty much are in metal for the cavalry options. I don't know of anybody who makes a plastic kit for them. So, take with that as you will. But on the whole, quite a few infantry options, which is exciting to see. You have a good mortar. You've got a good AT rifle team. You've got a good flamethrower. If you're running a medium mortar, an AT rifle, and a flamethrower, you're going to get good value out of all of those, which is great. You also get a versatile medium AT gun and the Brita 20 millimeter, both of which are fantastic. And you get the MMG tanks. You have some decent armored cars, and you've got some tiny tankettes, all of which are also pretty valuable. And then if you really want to, you can go with an auto protetto carrying, Gossatori or Paracaratisti paratroopers. Honestly, for speed, I think I would just go with cavalry. I think cavalry is just more reliable. I think you can get more out of them, and I think they're going to do more in terms of removal for better use of points. So that's what I would do personally for Italy. And so your list might look something like this. Now, this is not an optimized list. It's just to show you some of the fun shenanigans that Italy can do that other nations can't do. And so this is more of a barbecue style build with a lot of flamethrowers. So we're going to take a second lieutenant inexperience. This means we don't get any of the army special rule bonuses for it, but I needed the 15 points. So here we are. Um, we're going to take two groups of a Gossatori group with two flamethrowers, two assistants, and an officer. We'll take this at regular because we can. We're going to throw those into a transport to hopefully help them be a little more reliable. And then we're going to take 7 black shirt M battalion infantry in 2 squads. So we've got 7 and 7. Those guys are all fanatics using the case per rules, which is fun. And we're going to take 6 Savoia Cavalleria. So we've got a 6-man veteran cavalry section that we can use to run down people and then potentially run down somebody else nearby who wasn't a little more spread out. We'll take an AT rifle team just for some cover fire. And again, uses the rules. We'll take an inexperienced medium mortar, the way that I liked it in 2nd edition. We'll take a regular flamethrower team because having 5 infantry-based flamethrowers is better than 4. We'll take the Brita 20 millimeter. We'll take an M1542 machine gun tank. I thought about taking yet another flamethrower here and then coupling that with the L640 flamethrower tank yet in the armored car section. I decided not to. One, because I knew I was going to probably need the firepower, and I knew that I needed reliable supporting fire to make sure that the flamethrowers could actually get where they need to go. Otherwise, the only threats on table are going to be the flamethrowers, and at least 1 or 2 of them are going to get knocked out before they ever reach anybody. So we'll give them a nice solid threat that they can deal with. Damage value 8 without vulnerable is reasonable in terms of being able to weather the storm. You'll take a couple hits before going down. And then we've got a regular truck that will carry our infantry-based flamethrowers in very, very quickly, drop them off, and then probably go down, but we'll take some shots with machine guns before we go. That gives us 13 order dice, so it's relatively small, but the units are relatively durable, and the stuff works out pretty okay in conjunction together, and in conjunction with the Army Special Rules. So, again, this is not the meta for Italy. This is not how you quote-unquote should be running Italy, but it does help to showcase what you can do with them. And it's pretty cool and pretty unique. A lot of people don't get access to that many flamethrowers in general, but even flamethrower vehicles, let alone the ability to double up with them in squads and potentially, I guess, take up to 5 of those squads if you really wanted to. So there's quite a few options there for you to take. So what are we looking at for Italy in 3rd edition so far? Now, I should note that this was recorded after the Minor Nations update came out. So we are aware of the change that happened to the Army Special Rule. But just for starters, the infantry took a hit because all the case blue special abilities are gone. We don't have those anymore. You don't have nearly as much diversity. You don't have as much depth in terms of how these go and as many options. That being said, paratroopers can now take more submachine guns than their original 2nd edition counterparts. So if you like submachine guns, and second edition was fine for submachine guns, I think they're better in 3rd edition, even with the points increase to 4 points per gun. So you might consider taking big squads of paratroopers if you really wanted to. Flamethrowers are worse. Their range stayed the same, but otherwise everything about them got worse. Lower penetration. Well, and I guess the number of hits that they end up doing stayed the same, but like the amount of penetration got worse. In general, hitting with them got worse. They run out of fuel more easily, and the points went up. So yes, you're one of those nations that can take a lot of flamethrowers. You can still do barbecue pretty effectively with Italy, but you're going to run out of fuel an awful lot faster on all of those, which means you could find yourself, well, running out of fuel before the end of the match. And your army just grinds to a halt, which could be problematic. You no longer get the improved AT on your AT rifles, your autocannons, stuff like that. So it's just not as effective anymore. Which is kind of sad because that was kind of one of the things that was the buoying and saving grace for Italy, not having a wide variety of relatively, affordable, decent AT options. They could afford to rely on something that was a little bit lighter, and now you still can. They're just as good as every other nation, right? Your tanks are still pretty good because in a world where everybody's machine guns get halved, the guys with lots of machine guns still do pretty okay. Your Sahariana is actually worse, obviously because it's damage value 6, so it's removed very easily. It's still pretty expensive because you still can only take it at veteran. So, like, you're paying a premium on everything and you're not necessarily getting a lot of value out of it. So there's that. And your transports did get better because we now have the Protetto. And the Protetto is basically the auto Protetto from before. It's a damage value 7 vehicle, but it's fully enclosed. And you can get it with up to transport 20. So you could put several really big units in there. So if you wanted to bring like two 8-man or 9-man squads of paratroopers, all with submachine guns, and throw in an officer, maybe put in like a, maybe that's what you do. You do like two 8-man squads of paratroopers, all with submachine guns. They're expensive, but they're effective. And then you include like a flamethrower team and a company commander. And then you can issue an order to the company commander, and you can, then issue one of your orders to the transport, one to the flamethrower team, and then two more to the paratroopers, and then you'd be set, right? You're in for the win at that point, and they can all go on advance, and then you can move up the transport, and then suddenly all of these units start jumping out, and you've cleared a zone for you to be able to work in afterwards. That could be really effective. That's an expensive proposition. It's a lot of eggs in one basket. It's the one problem with Russian doll theory on a really, really big transport with big veteran units. But that could take a whole section of the board for you as early as even turn 1. So on the whole, how are these? They're fine. I mean, they're not like particularly amazing. I don't think Italy is even as good as 10th place, honestly, in third edition, at least as of yet. And with the rules changed to their army special rules, the one big reason for running Italy was that on the first turn, opponents couldn't run, period, which was really powerful. Now, on first wave, they can, but on anything else, they can't. So it's still mostly useful because most scenarios actually are probably not going to use first wave. In as much as they do, my guess is if you go to a tournament, especially if they're rolling up for it, on average, you should only run into one of those. So in general, your opponents are getting gimped. They are being held back. If it doesn't appear for one game, there are a good number of nations who don't get to use one of their special rules in one game. So on the whole, I don't think it's a big deal in terms of what we've lost there. I do think there's some room for improvement though. And so toward that end, in terms of things that I would do, first of all, I would add in a bunch of the flavor that we lost. So I expect a lot of that's coming when the army book comes. That's what we've been seeing for the other army books so far. But I would also just in general add some new stuff. I would add the colonial options that should be there from the Italian colonial forces that we didn't really get at all in the last 2 editions. I would add Ascari infantry, which could be like veteran tough fighter infantry, like we saw with one of our previous videos. I would also take a look at the Dubats, and I'm going to butcher a bunch of these names. I'm really sorry. These were, kind of localized fighters, some of whom did have professional training, so I'd allow you to take them either inexperienced or regular. And the thing is, they just ignore the -1 penalty to come in from outflank. So you can take in some guys who are, kind of locals who know the area and the terrain, and they maneuver to a point where they can get a good ambush. I would also include the Maharisti Libyan Camel Cavalry. This would be inexperienced regular or veteran cavalry that have the Fieldcraft special rule. And the nice thing about these is they're camels, right? The camel riders that were used by local forces, and I think that could just be fun to see on the table. It gives a fun little opportunity for doing some customizations and kit bashing in order to get yourself some Italian troops on camels, which is kind of fun. Special rules that help are always great on top of that. And then you'd have your Ethiopian Bande troops. These were professional troops and sometimes mercenary troops that fought but were not necessarily reliable. They would sometimes go to the highest bidder. So I would do this kind of in an interesting way, similar to what we saw with Romania in the old edition, where you do regular or veteran troops that have the Fieldcraft special rule because they're locals, they know the area, but they also have shirkers. So they're always taking an order test, even if they don't have any pins. Admittedly, they're regular and veteran, so they should pass those, no problem. But they'll also count all their pins as double. So you really kind of have to work with them. You have to keep them in, but it also makes them a good bit less expensive. Could be very, very useful. I would also potentially look into adding some partisan units. There were Italian partisans that fought back against Allied forces when they started pushing into Italy. Part of the reasons why the advance slowed down. And I feel like that could be kind of interesting, give them almost a partisan flair, allow them to take like 5 to 20 dudes, give them a mix of, rifles, shotguns, stuff like that. Could be very interesting, gives again a different way to kind of play the game and another way to be able to save yourself some points in case you want to run something big elsewhere. I would also re-add in the Modelo 37 versatile medium AT gun, just because I love the idea of giving people versatile options in case they want those. May cost a few points more than you would pay otherwise for a similar style of gun, but probably worth it. And then in terms of the three subtypes that I would include for the Italy book, I mean, I feel like it's pretty obvious they're going to do black shirts, which is choice of fanatics, and you can take them at pretty much any veterancy you want. You'll see a Bersaglieri thing, probably veteran only, where you can pay +1 point, maybe for rapid fire, which kind of took the place of fire and maneuver from the old edition. Honestly, I would hope it would be something a little more interesting than that, but that is probably what we're likely to see. And then maybe an Alpini Force veteran only, where you play an extra point per man for fieldcraft. And that would give you a more defensive option, a more offensive option, and a more mobile option, which is a really good triangle if you're going to have three subtypes to keep them all pretty distinct. In terms of new special rules, I would give them defensive strategy, which is the current one we have, and they get you by PDF. This is not enough in order to be an army special rule. It's very copy paste from what we've seen from other nations, and it leaves a lot to be desired. So then I would also include improvised AT, which is similar to Case Blue. When you're rolling with a +2 modifier for penetration on a weapon, you can re-roll the failed wound rolls. Again, it's not really going to hurt most armor. It's not even going to hurt that much in terms of infantry, just because a lot of people have to fire HE against infantry, so you don't even have very many of those in terms of actual options for +2 penetration, other than your medium howitzers, your medium mortars, and your light howitzers. But I think it does make some of their options a little more reliable. It makes it more interesting, and I like that, and it's more unique. And then I would give them a choice of the last three, and the first would be a revamp of defensive position, where effectively we would allow them to just place the free 6x6 inch heavy cover area with three sides having heavy cover. Because some people may want to be a little more defensive, but they don't necessarily want to play black shirts. They want them to survive a little bit longer by throwing down some extra cover. I think that's great. Makes your side of the board a little more reliable, which is good. And then I would do a change to Avanti Savoia. It's an interesting concept. And so here's what I would do. I would make it so that their officer morale ranges are increased by 3 inches. So you're not increasing the morale bonus. You're not increasing the snap 2 that you get off of any of these. You're just increasing your ranges from 6 inches and 12 inches to 9 inches and 15 inches. Which means that in as much as your men are near the officers, they'll probably do their job. And as soon as the officer is gone, maybe they'll keep doing their job, maybe they won't. It is useful, not strictly necessary, right? You could live without that bonus. But if you were like, man, I'm walking into a meta where a lot of people like running a lot of machine guns and like running their AT rifles, and they're just throwing pins down range for very cheap every single turn. It might be nice just to be able to be like, well, more of my guys are going to get that morale bump. I can stay hidden behind this building a little bit longer, right? And I think that that could be very useful. On the whole, Italy is interesting. They've got some cool design functions. We know quite a bit about the soldiers that they fielded, and they had a very interesting and well-disciplined army corps. They ultimately were on the wrong side of a lot of engagements, both because of logistical shortages and a bunch of other issues that came about. Plus, I mean, they were up against the industrial power of two nations that could easily match them in a lot of places that they were up against. So, like, I don't have a negative opinion of the Italian army from World War II. That being said, it doesn't exactly surprise me that they came in a little lower in the rankings than some of the big headliner sort of nations. And that's just frankly because they rely on a very small number of profiles, right? I mean, you could run Italians with black shirt infantry only, the M1542 tank, the auto blinda, a medium mortars, maybe some sort of artillery option, but honestly, anti-aircrafts are probably better. The Breed is probably better, and it comes in the starter army, so you already have one. And then maybe a transport, and you can live off of those 6 options, right? In the entire list. A lot of what we see is interesting stuff, but in the end game, probably not actually going to be taken, and a lot of it is padding. And padding is what tends to push you down in these lists. I do think that with a couple of extra changes, they really could be very interesting. And again, it's not to say that you won't win if you play Italy, right? I mean, Italy has fared, especially post Case Blue. It's not like they were dominant, but they did win a good bit. They were very powerful. And so even though they may come in 10th on this list in terms of the options that are available to you, the options that you do have are fantastic. But what do you think? Am I a little too harsh on the Italian, call it infantry, on their armored vehicles? Did I not rate something as high as they probably should be? Let us know down in the comments below, and I will see you next time.